The year is 1535. 10 years earlier, one of the most powerful uprisings in European worker history, the German Peasants' War, has been crushed brutally. Almost 100,000 people are dead after the conflict. And over in the town of Munster, the New Jerusalem commune has been drowned in blood. All of its leaders lie dead. All across Europe, at the same time, women have become the target of a new and innovative type of power, a biopower that seeks to control their literal bodies. This is the foundation of capitalism. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. This is chapter 2 in Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. This is the longest chapter in the book. It is the most sweeping chapter in the book. And I established in the last video that chapters 1 and 2 really work together. So chapter 1 provides a really nice bedrock, and then chapter 2 jumps off into theories of primitive accumulation and biopower, both lenses we're going to use today to look at the events of history that Silvia Federici is laying out in this book. My dog is wandering around in the background. If he pops up, that's just that. Anyway, we're really sticking with the history this week. Next week, we will get into theories of the body, of feminism, of feminine power and magic. A lot of theory in the chapter we're tackling next week. But for now, we're kind of sticking with history. We're going deeper into the feudal period and into the Middle Ages. We're going through the Age of Discovery and into the 17th century. So we're going to break all of this down into 4 different sections. The first section, we're going to talk about the War on the Commons. Remember, we established the commons last week as this kind of basis for power for the medieval proletariat, this peasantry, the serfs that worked around the lord's castle. So we're going to talk about the death of the commons, or the war on the commons. Second, we're going to talk about the state encroaching on the womb, literally reproducing capitalism. Third, we're going to talk about some of the state-driven efforts to construct femininity. A lot of this you will recognize in the modern day. So some of the ways that we think about femininity and the role of the woman, a lot of that comes from this particular period in time. So we'll get into all that. Finally, in this video, we are going to talk about the colonies and Europe, or the European proletariat in the context of conquest. So as these empires go out to seek new lands and new resources, what does this mean for the proletariat that is left back home? We're going to dive into all of that. Now, as I said, this is a gigantic chapter. We're necessarily kind of skimming a few things. If you think I've missed anything key, please always let me know. As always, I love to start these lectures with a quick thank you to the people who subscribe on Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. It really, really means the world. These lectures that are freely available to anybody, they are made possible because of your support. It really, really helps. And I think it helps kind of make this information available for as many people that want it. I never wanted to paywall any of this stuff. So if you are not yet a Patreon subscriber, please consider checking out that Patreon, patreon.com/champagne anarchism. You can go and find all of the books that we've done so far, everything from Wretched of the Earth up to the Ecology of Freedom, and these ongoing lectures that I'm doing on Caliban and the Witch, and much more. I have 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series. There is a movies thing that me and my sister just sit down and we talk about leftist films. It's just kind of fun over there. So go check that out if you have a chance. But let's get into this, because there is a lot to talk about. And let's start with the War on the Commons. So as we established last time, before capitalism, in this kind of feudal period, the early feudal period, land in much of Europe is held in common. It is not owned, it is not fenced in, it is shared. The commons aren't just kind of fields and forests or pastures, they are, but they're also the basis for an entire social system, a system that uses these things in common. Silvia Federici really believes in this idea of the commons, and we have contrasted the idea of the commons before with ideas of usufruct. We talked about that back when we talked about Murray Bookchin. We will come to this kind of later on in this series again and kind of compare and contrast these ideas. But for now, just know that the commons for Federici is a foundational part of kind of worker solidarity in the early feudal period. And Contrasted to that, there is an entire apparatus of elite power that wants to destroy the commons, because it is a basis of power. Because the commons, and this is not because of any high-minded idealism or ideology, this is just practical everyday life. The commons protect the peasants from famine. They also root everything in kind of a collective decision-making and root the life around the commons in kind of a mutual aid system necessarily. But capitalism doesn't like care. Capitalism does not like the commons. It needs property. It needs profit. And it needs control. And so that is what the elites set out to do when they started waging the war on the commons. Now, Federici in this book tells a really clear story and links everything to kind of the enclosure movement, which happens through many means throughout Europe and also through literal legal means with the enclosure laws in England. But it is a lot messier than she kind of presents it necessarily. There's a lot of history. It happens very, very differently in a lot of different regions. But we will stick to Federici's story here just with the little note that, listen, as with all of European history that spans hundreds of years, it's quite complex, this whole system. But what we can for sure say is that in England, there were enclosure laws, and all of this kind of begins in England. Fields are fenced in, villages are broken, people are kind of thrown off the land that they have lived on and farmed mutually for generations. Federici notes that before the Reformation, 2,000 rural communities had already been erased. This is also happening in parallel with the encomienda system in the Americas. So we talked about this when we talked about the open veins of Latin America, Eduardo Galeano's absolute masterpiece. The encomienda system is essentially taking indigenous lands, fencing them in. About 1/3 of all indigenous land, by the way, kind of fenced in and given over to these kind of fiefdoms that operate sort of as plantations. They are much different from the fiefdoms that we see in Europe because they are essentially using mostly slave labor and some indentured servants, but this is kind of, these two systems have a lot in common. And that makes sense because they are rooted in the same need, which is for capital to dominate and extract. But let's remove ourselves a little bit from the 1600s, or the 1500s, 1600s, and think about modern life and the arguments that we hear all the time. We are told, for example, that privatization is a way to bring efficiency. And if you can inject this kind of market system with competition and get rid of these things like the commons, these publicly owned things, that will foster more profit and more efficiency, and it will just be generally better for everybody involved. Well, this is an argument that we see all the way back then in the medieval period. This is the idea that if you can give this land, this common land, over to productive use, then production of things like food and agricultural goods will go up. That's kind of, that makes sense with the economics that's being done at the time, and then much later on when Adam Smith comes around to write The Wealth of Nations and stuff like that. But actually, with enclosure came hunger. So you have land privatization that doesn't feed people at all. It feeds markets. As land was seized, food prices soar in what we tend to call the price revolution. This, because of the work of people like Adam Smith, is often attributed to Spain. So Spain at the time, through the 1500s, was pulling a bunch of capital and resources and goods out of the Americas and flooding European markets with it. And with it, you get a rise in prices. But Federici points out, very rightly, that this is something that was happening long before the Spanish started to flood the market with Spanish gold. Actually, I should say Latin American gold. Federici also tells a story about a warehouse, for example, in Antwerp, and that's over in Belgium. In Antwerp, there was a warehouse that literally collapsed under the weight of the food that was being hoarded within it as people died of hunger on the streets outside. And this is very, very evocative imagery of the origins of the capitalist system. And of course, you can tie this to parallels in the modern day. This is very, very clear, and it's an evocative symbol for a reason, because we can kind of see this happening. Meanwhile, real wages, which are tied to inflation, collapse. And this has a lot of causes, but one of the primary ones is that all of a sudden there are a bunch of people seeking work in the towns, and this is driving down wages. So it's the opposite effect of after the Black Death, which we talked about last episode. In the Black Death, all of a sudden there are no workers, and so wages start to rise to the point that the nobility actually caps wages. They put a maximum wage. Now wages are falling. And who is hurt the most? Women. Women, prior to this, were already paid about half of what men were normally paid. Now they are paid a third of the new reduced wage. So this is a huge drop-off in female spending power. But here's the thing, because through this period, women are fighting back. As people are starving on the streets of Europe, women are leading food riots. To such an extent, in fact, that historians often called them women's riots. These weren't just random acts either. They were deeply political, and they were rooted in an act of survival in the face of extreme starvation. And of course, the state noticed. And in logic that you will see echoed, especially in the 4th chapter of this book, they started to talk about women and witchcraft and started to associate these two things. So you see language used like the diabolical banquet. So you get the idea, this imagery of female witches communing with Satan and feasting on white wine and mutton, and a fixation on food and witchcraft, trying to frame the search for food and the food riots with some dark, evil magic. But what was really happening here? Well, what was really happening is the state is criminalizing poor women for eating what the rich had hoarded. It was punishing women for demanding what had previously been shared. These witches, as they were branded, were not monsters. They were often midwives or herbalists or food thieves or rebels of some kind or another, protectors, in other words, of the commons. And remember the last episode when we talked about the rise of the early modern state and the way that women's bodies were subjugated in that push? This is tying into Federici's argument, because as the land is being enclosed, so too were the women. This is Federici's line here. She says women became the new commons. So female bodies, female labor, their children's labor, and their children's bodies are all being absorbed into the economy, controlled and dominated. The old commons were fenced, and the new commons became the labor of women. And that takes us out of the commons and into reproducing capitalism. This idea that primitive accumulation didn't just happen on the battlefield, it happened in the human body, especially the female body. Because, and we see this a couple times with capitalism, that capitalism will find a really horrific answer to a problem that capitalism has caused. Once that land is fenced in, once people are starving on the streets, once wages have collapsed, capitalism has a problem, which is how then do you produce the next generation of workers? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's women. But not as workers, as wombs, literally as tools for producing workers specifically for the state and to feed into the capitalist machinery. This is one of the most brilliant arguments that comes out of Federici, and this is one of, I think, the strongest takeaways from this book, is that women themselves became subject to the capitalist machinery to produce new workers. Europe in the 1620s, 1630s is plunging into what is effectively a demographic drop-off, effectively a demographic collapse, just an absolute nosedive. Why? Well, mass death, you have plague, you have war, you have famine, you have collapse, economic collapse, and this is feeding into real demographic problems, akin to what you have following the end of the Black Death. And just because we are continuing with our comparison between the Americas and Europe, let's also say that there is a genocide going on in the Americas at the time. Now, in Europe, you have a demographic collapse, which is slightly different from a genocide being done on behalf of the Spanish Empire and sort of directed, but effectively this is a very, very similar thing. And this, by the way, is where Silvia Federici starts taking on Michel Foucault a little bit, because Foucault develops this idea of biopower and says, listen, biopower was developed and really starts to come around into its own in the 18th century. Federici is locating this much, much earlier, in fact, in the 16th century, really. You have anything that could be considered infanticide becoming an executable offense. In France, France, there's a 1556 royal edict that forces women to register every pregnancy. And if the child dies in secret, even from a miscarriage, it's a capital crime. You also have some insane laws coming out of the book. So women who don't show enough enthusiasm during the childbirth process or with their progeny, that's also punishable. And then you have this sort of proto-state spying apparatus, which is if a midwife wants to continue practicing, she will become a spy, essentially, for the state. Now, at the same time that all of this is happening with women, you also have a massive expansion of state power, because this is around the time that we start to see the rise of public assistance. That kind of sounds like a good thing, but in practice, what it meant was new forms of control. So you have about 60 towns and states across Europe that begin experimenting with this kind of public assistance. It's not really generosity. This is surveillance. We are talking things like workhouses, like record keeping and conditional aid. These are a type of relief given to the poor that is only given if they are deserving. And the deserving are those who work or reproduce properly. And again, this all comes back to the idea of biopower, right? It's a new type of power. It's a power not to take and give life necessarily, but the power to organize life, to measure it, to categorize it, and to control it. So you have a type of discipline that we often assume starts with the rise of the factory, right? With industrialization. But what Federici is saying here is, no. This starts in the home. This starts in the hospital. This starts in the parish and in the birthing room. This is the primitive accumulation of the reproductive body. And this is the body that doesn't produce goods in the sense of a factory. This is a body that produces the producers of the goods. And that's pretty evil if you think about it. Now, of course, the state does not stop at reproduction. We'll just talk about this very quickly, although Federici makes a huge point of this in the book, and if you get a chance to read the chapter, it is a very, very interesting read through, but it doesn't stop at reproduction, the state. It does start to try to transform people into workers by destroying all the kind of old networks of support and resistance that they had before. So things like outlawing communal games or banning village festivals and monitoring the alehouses where people congregate and talk. It's kind of a full transformation of these sites, these points of contact where worker power could potentially be developed. And even the church at this point stops being a refuge for the poor. Federici makes an argument that instead of the communal confessional, which is normal before this period, now confession becomes a individualized thing, and that is to kind of segment people out. And that could very well be true. Because the first step into turning people into individual units of production is to turn them into individuals. And that's exactly what's happening here. But let's leave that aside and then come to this idea of femininity, because our modern conception of femininity is also very rooted in what was happening back then. This is, for those early states, a new frontier. So once the state has seized control of women's reproduction, it moves on to their labor. Because women weren't just raising the next generation of workers, they're also working and brewing and midwifing and healing and selling and sewing and cooking. And now that has to be stopped. The work that women are doing has to be, again, a new form of commons for the men. So you have sort of traditional female roles. Ale making and midwifing become kind of male roles. Men start to take over those positions, especially in hospitals. The herbal medicine becomes defined as a type of witchcraft. Prostitution, which used to be the only form of income for many women at this point, because there was, as we talked about in the last video, there was a huge reliance by these early states on trying to break up rebellion by pushing prostitution as much as possible. Now prostitution, because it's become a locus of power and wages for women, starts to become outlawed and banned and against the church edicts. So between about 1530 and 1560, town brothels are shut down across most of Europe. Sex workers are being punished, and Federici is quite clear here. This isn't about morality. This is about control. When it's useful for the state for sex work to exist, then the state pushes it. And when it's not useful for the state to exist, then the state bans it. There is, in other words, a conscious effort to remove women from the economy, except as unpaid domestic labor. Federici notes, and this is really interesting, actually, that this wasn't just the sort of major capitalist class pushing for this. It was, but it was also supported by local independent craftsmen who also wanted women out of the economy in many places. Why is that? Well, it has a lot to do with the fact that those massive capitalist enterprises could afford to bring in women and employ them in large numbers and pay them significantly less than the male workers, versus a independent craftsman who has just themselves or a couple other workers, often family workers. That's a very difficult thing to compete with. So it makes sense for them to try to get women out of the economy. That's just kind of a knock-on effect that Federici raises, but it brings to mind, to me, this idea of divide and conquer tactics, right? There is profit to be made kind of at every level here. And so if you can exclude women, if you can scapegoat women, so much the better as far as the state is concerned. Anyway, back to notions of femininity. So femininity is important here because what happens in this moment is quietly devastating. What you have is effectively what Silvia Federici frames as the forging of a new sexual contract, one that disguised women's exploitation behind new identities. So now, instead of women as the worker, active participant in society and kind of a person with access to the economy and wages, now they are mothers, they are wives, and they are daughters, or they are widows. And that's pretty much it. These aren't neutral roles. These are tools for a capitalist society that wants to produce more workers and wants to subjugate the female body. Now, let's be really clear here, because of course you can sit here in the year 2025, or I'm recording this in 2025. I don't know when you're watching this, but I'm recording this in 2025. It's easy for us to sit here and say, what's wrong with being a mother? What's wrong with being a daughter? What's wrong with being a wife or a widow or any of this? Must we give value to women as a function of how they operate in an economy or a capitalist system? That's obviously nonsense. But what this represented back then, back in the Middle Ages, is literally a complete othering of women from the power base that existed at the time. What it meant, essentially, is defining women in a new role, and that new role is dependent on men. And when I say dependent on men, what I'm really saying is defining women as property or as resources, if you want to frame it through a capitalist lens. Again, back to Federici's idea of women becoming the new commons. Once the land had been fenced in and stolen, now the commons for men to depend on is the work done by women. This happens in a couple ways because women obviously continued to work. Many women did housework and extra jobs on the side, but legally, in most places around Europe, their wages could not be taken by them. They were controlled by their husbands. So you literally have female wages going to the men, but you also have housework. And Federici is a big deal when it comes to housework. She sort of pioneered a lot of the activism and advocacy around housework as being basically unpaid employment. For the men at the time, the women were cleaning and cooking and raising children. They were working outside of the home and bringing in extra wages. And this is essentially patriarchy as an economic system. Women at the time are also losing any kind of legal personhood that they once had. So in France, for example, they couldn't sign contracts and they couldn't speak in court. In Germany, a widow needed a male tutor to manage her affairs. Women all over Europe at this point, in fact, were losing the right to act in the world because all of a sudden, their role was no longer public. Their role was in the home. Their role was to reproduce and to serve the men in the house. Federici ties this to a specific Shakespeare play. She's, of course, referencing The Tempest through most of this, but in this case, she's referencing The Taming of the Shrew. The Taming of the Shrew, she says, became kind of the propaganda, the defining cultural artifact of the time, because in the Taming of the Shrew, a rebellious woman is tamed by a man and becomes the image of the gentle wife, submissive and loving and kind of apolitical, and that is kind of the anthem of this period of time. The new woman and the notion of femininity is a woman as docile, as domestic, and grateful to the men who are there providing for her. That's kind of her new role. And this is why I started this whole video talking about how you can see these notions of femininity now, because we still sort of have this ingrained in a lot of our society. This level of patriarchy has never really gone away, and a lot of it is traceable back to not the prevailing attitudes at the time, that of course, but the literal specific efforts by the European state, the elite, the apparatus of control and domination to push these ideas of femininity and what the perfect female is supposed to be. But that's femininity. Let's leave femininity for now and talk about the last thing that I really wanted to talk about in this chapter, which has everything to do with colonization. So while Europe is disciplining the poor and its women, it's also looking outward for labor and land and, of course, gold and silver. That's what Spain really wants more than anything else. So colonization and the slave trade didn't just enrich European elites, it also made capitalism possible. So we talk about the accumulation of capital. This is, of course, built on the subjugated bodies of women, but it's also a ton of resources coming in from Latin America and free labor in the form of slavery on the encomienda systems of the new continent that they've just discovered. New in the European sense of the time. The New World is not really a new world for the people who are already there. Anyway, Federici in this book reminds us that that is not separate from what's happening back home in Europe. It's kind of the same system, just in other forms. Now, goods that are produced by enslaved people flooded into European markets, and they fed European workers, they set wages, they determined prices. The plantation and the factory are kind of eminently connected. So capitalism comes from this initial period of globalization. That's effectively what this is. It's racialized and it's gendered, and it's happening over there and it's happening back home, and it's all kind of similar. Now, many of this emerging European proletariat wanted to go to the New World because of conditions back home. Things were bad in Europe, and they saw this as a method of escape. And that is why elites who were running the conquest very tightly controlled access to the quote-unquote New World. It's not an escape that is made available to anybody. It's kind of very, very tightly controlled. The only way that you could really get through if you were not wealthy was through indentured servitude or transportation. Transportation is what happens when they take criminals like Australia and send them to a new location to work. That's transportation. And that, in retrospect, was probably a very wise decision on part of European elites, because what you had is all sorts of prisoners and vagabonds and rebels that are all being shipped over and making fairly quick alliances with the indigenous people who are also being exploited. And so because of that, you have brutal oppression and the formalization of slavery. Federici goes back to The Tempest for this example, but she talks about the alliance between Caliban, who's the representative for the indigenous subjugated world, and Trinculo and Stefano, who are kind of stand-ins for the European workers who have also shipwrecked on this island. And Caliban, at one point in the narrative, looks like he may form an alliance with these two to try to overthrow Prospero. Again, Prospero, the powerful sorcerer who's been shipwrecked on the island for years and is now pulling the strings and has subjugated both Caliban and Ariel. What Federici says is that this, in Shakespeare, was a symbol for potential solidarity, and so it had to be crushed, just like it was in The Tempest. Spoilers for The Tempest. But at first, you have, in these new plantations, landless, white, unmarried women working side by side with enslaved peoples. They often, not always, but they could often labor together. They were sort of pushed off onto these plantations in a similar form to the enslaved people that were forced to work the plantations. They often labored together, and it was a unity that was extremely dangerous for the ruling elites of the time. So if you are confronted with that as a landowner, you have to start intervening, and it helps to intervene legally. Not necessarily violently, violently, but often just laws being passed to criminalize interracial marriage, to criminalize sex across racial lines, more laws to police reproduction. This is a new form of biopower in the colony. And then, of course, you get the classic divide and conquer thing. If you can institutionalize slavery, you can make it so the enslaved are an underclass and drive a wedge between them and these dispossessed white women. Federici makes the argument that there were exchanges. There were plenty of exchanges across racial lines, especially the exchanging of knowledge that would help fuel some type of resistance. Things like herbal medicine, like healing, like magical practices. This was often interchanged. And we'll get back to the idea of magic actually next week, and then even more in the 4th chapter and 5th chapter of this book. The rest of this book, actually, we're going to talk a lot about magic and this idea of magic as a form of resistance. But it was ultimately resistance. And even in systems designed to erase them, the enslaved women started to build new forms of power. In the Caribbean, they became kind of producers and marketers and cultivators. They also started to fulfill roles as healers and seers and midwives. So these things that are happening in the colonies, just something to sort of keep in the back of your head as we continue to go through this book. We will refer back to them, but what you have at the end of all of this process is a successful campaign on behalf of European elites in the colonies to discipline and sow division and surveil and control reproduction, both in the Americas and back in Europe. And this is tremendously successful in both cases. Basically, the same power that enclosed the European commons and made women the new commons, so too was the indigenous and the African body enclosed. It's a very, very similar process. And all of that leaves us with an image of capitalism as born in fire and subjugation. I'll leave you with that thought today, but let me know what you think about any and all of this. I know this is an enormous chapter. There is stuff that necessarily we have had to skip out on. If there's any of that you read that you think is worth mentioning, please let me know in the comments, send me a message directly, check out the Patreon, all of that good stuff. But also, how does this change the way that you view modern notions of femininity? We talked a little bit in the intro lecture about queer theory and building in some notion of queer theory. And we'll get back to that when we talk about the body as well. But for now, how do you kind of square those two notions? The notion of this constructed femininity during this medieval period and our modern notions of femininity and how they are challenged or potentially undermined by our notions of queerness. It's a really interesting topic as far as I'm concerned. As always, let me know what you think. I love hearing people's feedback. I just think it's awesome that people would be engaging with a book like Caliban and the Witch. And I will see you next time when we talk about the great Caliban. See you then.